inside your medicine cabinet, right now, there's a clock ticking. It's not on the wall, it's stamped on every single box and bottle. Today, we're diving into the incredibly high-stakes race against medicine expiry dates. It's a hidden logistical battle where failure isn't just about losing money, it's about risking lives.
So, to get our heads around this, let's start with a really simple question. Think about the medicine you have at home. What could it possibly have in common with, say, a carton of milk?
Yep, you guessed it. They both have an expiry date. But that is where the similarity ends. And it ends fast. I mean, sour milk might ruin your morning cereal. But a medicine that's expired and lost its effectiveness, that can have devastating consequences. The stakes are just on a completely different level.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into what we're calling the ticking clock problem. Then, we'll look at the showdown between human planners and computer algorithms. After that, we'll check out the global rules everyone has to play by, see how that shelf life date is actually set, and finally, we'll wrap up with the final verdict. All right, let's dive into part 1, the ticking clock problem. This is all about the incredibly complex race to get medicine from a factory into the hands of a patient, all before that clock runs out. You see, managing a pharmaceutical supply chain is like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces are always changing. A case study with Bristol-Myers Squibb really laid out just how tricky this is. You've got medicines that expire, obviously, production lines that don't always give you what you expect, patient demand that goes up and down unpredictably, and on top of all that, you have to make these drugs in huge batches. It is a logistical nightmare. And one of the biggest pieces of that puzzle? Long lead times. We're talking about the total time from starting production to actually getting the medicine delivered. In the case study, this could take up to 12 weeks. Just think about that for a second. A drug could lose a huge chunk of its shelf life before it even leaves the factory, let alone makes it to your local pharmacy. The clock is already ticking, loud and fast.
Okay, so if the problem is that complicated, how do companies even begin to tackle it? That brings us to our second section, man versus machine planning. This is the hunt for the absolute best way to manage inventory.
So, researchers looked at 2 different approaches. On one side, you have expert human planners. Their number one goal, above everything else, is to make sure a patient never gets turned away. They do this by keeping extra medicine on hand, a kind of safety net. It's very safe, but it's also really expensive. On the other side, you have computer algorithms. They're programmed to be as efficient as possible and to lower costs. They're lean, but that also means they can be more fragile if something unexpected happens.
So, could AI be the tiebreaker? Well, here comes the new challenger, a type of AI called deep reinforcement learning, or DRL. The easiest way to think about it is this. It's a computer that learns the same way we do, through trial and error. It runs millions of simulations, testing out different strategies to find the absolute best way to manage this whole system.
But, and this is a huge but, when you put all 3 to the test, the humans, the old-school algorithms, and the new AI, you see this critical trade-off. The machines, both old and new, were cheaper to run on average, no question, but they also had much higher performance variability. What that really means is, while they save money most of the time, they're also way more likely to have a massive failure, like a huge stockout. It's a classic gamble, efficiency versus safety.
Now, even if a company comes up with what they think is the perfect strategy, they're not operating in a bubble. And that brings us to Section 3, the global rule book, because every single decision has to follow very strict international policies.
And the most important concept here is called remaining shelf life, or RSL. This isn't just the total life of the drug. It's the amount of time left on the clock when it gets delivered. Countries all over the world have minimum RSL rules to make sure medicines are still safe and to stop waste.
And these rules are no joke. Take a look at this table from the World Health Organization for emergency health kits. If a kit has, let's say, about 2.5 years of shelf life total, it has to ship from the supplier with at least 18 months left. It has to get through customs with 12 months left, and it has to get to the actual clinic or hospital with a bare minimum of 6 months remaining. Every step of the way, that clock is being checked.
So why all the rules? Well, the WHO is very clear about it. These policies are in place for 3 big reasons: to stop wealthy countries from dumping nearly expired drugs on poorer nations, to prevent dangerous shortages, and to stop perfectly good medicine from expiring in a warehouse. All of this talk about expiry dates leads to a pretty basic question, right? That brings us to Section 4. How is that date, the one that starts this whole ticking clock in the first place, actually decided?
Well, it all comes down to a super rigorous scientific process called stability testing. It basically has 4 steps. First, scientists design a study. Then, they take samples from batches and test them over and over again at set time intervals. They're looking for any changes. Is the drug losing potency? Are impurities creeping in? And finally, based on all that data, they can scientifically calculate the point in time where the product might not meet its quality standards anymore. And boom, that's your expiry date.
And this isn't just a ballpark estimate. To get an expiry date approved by regulators, a company has to provide a mountain of data from at least 3 different full-sized production batches. They need to prove without a doubt that the product is stable and safe before it can ever get to a patient.
So after all that, where do we land? Let's bring it all home in our final section, the final verdict. Because the challenge of this ticking clock is definitely not going away anytime soon.
The research makes one thing incredibly clear. There is no silver bullet here. What we have is this fundamental tension. Humans will always lean towards safety, even if it costs more, because the goal is the patient. Machines, on the other hand, will lean towards efficiency, saving money but accepting more risk. So the answer isn't about picking one over the other. It's about creating a hybrid system, where smart technology operates within the safety guardrails set by human expertise.
And this leaves us with one last big question for the future. As AI gets more and more sophisticated, will it eventually learn to value safety just as much as it values efficiency? Will it finally solve this puzzle for us? Or, when it comes to a life or death supply chain, is this a race that will always need a human heart and a human hand to run the final lap?